Style transcends race, class, and time. André Leon Talley was an American fashion journalist, creative director, and editor-at-large for Vogue magazine. He was the fashion magazine's first African-American creative director. He was an acclaimed fashion icon whose taste and style transcended decades, and he was known for his advocacy of diversity within the fashion world. Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Beauty History. I am your host, Allison Chase. Beauty History is where we take a deep dive into the life, the legacy, the importance of a fashion or beauty icon. But before we go any further, let's take a second to grab our iced coffee or a hot coffee. Let's take a sip and let's get started. Join me the first Friday of each and every month for a new episode. So a little bit of light housekeeping first. I would like to send a shout out, a huge thank you for those of you in the community who've been using the thanks button. This is a way to send me a tip and to send me extra support and love. So I just want to take a few moments just to extend an extra level of gratitude for those of you who sent me a thanks last month. A special thank you goes out to Elena Polshakov, Mary Walquist, Iman Court-Bowie, DJF, Christina O'Connell, and the Foxy Century. Thank you so much. And thank you all of you who watch these videos, who leave comments. Many of you leave novels and tons of paragraphs, and I love it. I love how into fashion and history and culture and pop culture you are. I think we found our people here. So today we will be talking about André Leon Talley, alt André Leon Talley. Now, let's start from the beginning. André Leon Talley was born October 16th, 1948. I think that makes him a Libra, but I'm not certain exactly. He was the son of Alma Ruth Davis and William Carroll Talley. He was technically born in Washington, D.C., but when he was 2 months old, he moved to Durham, North Carolina, and he was actually raised by his grandmother, his maternal grandmother. Apparently, this was something that was common at the time where working young professionals would send their children off to be raised by their grandparents. I mean, that's not that uncommon. We've seen this type of thing happen before. So he addressed his maternal grandmother as Mama. That's who his Mama was. So he was raised in the Jim Crow segregated South. That was his upbringing and his experience. His grandmother was a domestic worker, domestic cleaner. She worked for the men's campus at Duke University. So she wasn't attending the university, but she was always in close proximity to it, but didn't have access to it. Also, his maternal grandfather fought in the First World War in France. I think that could be a very interesting episode, which is unrelated to beauty, but African American and people of color fighting in the First and Second World War. Because when we think of the First and Second World War, we definitely have a more white vision of it, but that isn't actually the case. And I believe at least one, maybe both of his grandfathers, at least one was also a sharecropper in the South as well. Now, unfortunately, because André grew up in Durham, North Carolina, in the Jim Crow era, he and his family and his grandmother were subject to racially motivated violence. He did write in his book that I have right here that I will be using as reference many times, that he was subject to violence once when he was a really young child. He just happened to be walking in like the white side of town and got chased down and beaten up by some kids. And speaking of the racially motivated violence and that effect that had on him, and mostly his grandmother as well, he spoke about it in his book and also just in general. He said that quote, "For a long time, my grandmother would not allow white people to come into our house. That was her rule. The only white man who came into the house was the coroner," end quote. Okay. So from his grandmother, because like I said, she was Mama. She was the matriarch, his mother, his parent, his guiding light, his guiding force in life. He really developed this appreciation for finer things, for luxury. They weren't rich, definitely not rich. Maybe poor well, definitely working class. Like, they didn't have luxury by any means, but she instilled in him this taking pride in yourself. She instilled in him this necessity to take pride in yourself and in the things that you have. And so I think that helped cultivate an appreciation for the finer things in life, for more cultured things. And a couple of things that were important to his household was doing chores. He always had lots of chores to do. He had responsibilities. He just had to do things like he was a child, but also he had work to do at home. And also the church. The church played a really significant role, especially in his grandmother's life, but also in his life, in his development, and also later in life, he would remain I don't know if a practicing Christian is the right word, but the black church, the black Southern church, played a huge impact in his development. So regular Sunday school, regular Sunday services, baptisms, any rites of passages, weddings in the community, whatever, like Easter services, Christmas Eve, etc. Like, it was a huge role in his family and in his life every day. Basically, everything revolved around the church. And for him, this was a really great experience because, like I said, he grew up in the segregated Jim Crow South, very violent, scary at times. But whenever he would step foot into the black church, everyone around him, all the adults, men, women, were dressed their Sunday best. They were wearing the fanciest hats, gorgeous gloves, silk gloves, pressed suits, and they all had pride. They had pride in themselves, pride in the way that they were presented, proud in the way that they were speaking and carrying themselves, and the church, the community, offered safety and community and oneness, and it was just like a really positive experience because, again, he could see like the pride that adults had in themselves, which they should have been proud of themselves, instead of, getting chased down the street because of the skin color. So it was just like a very positive, uplifting experience for him. He attended Lyon Park Elementary with some cousins and some local friends. It was an okay experience. Like, he was always a very good student, but he did experience a little bit of bullying, even from the kids in his own community, unfortunately. But at a young age, like, André was an only child, and so he grew up around a lot of adults. His grandmother, his great-grandmother was with him also for some time, and her friends and her coworkers. And so he actually spent a lot of time around adults, more than kids his own age. I mean, obviously he went to school, but when he was at home or just like in his community, he spent a lot of time with adults. And so I think he developed, I don't know if intellectually is the right word, but he just learned to speak like an adult, and he would often take his time in responding to the adults because he was speaking to people that were 30, 40, 50 years older than him, and so their interest and their taste was different, and so he read a lot, and so he would take his time and be aware of what he was saying instead of just blurting out whatever came to his mind. And books, literature, and also music became an escape, a fantasy for him. He discovered his grandmother's records. He discovered Nina Simone, Aretha Franklin, Diana Ross, the greats. And so he spent hours and hours in their living room just listening to the records on repeat. I mean, who wouldn't? And also what's interesting is at a young age, he discovered the Titanic. The Titanic, the disaster that happened, the luxury cruise ship that was supposed to be unsinkable. One of his aunts had like a hard copy book talking about this luxury cruise line or luxury cruise ship that was supposed to cross the Atlantic, that was meant to be unsinkable and had lots of decadence and luxury. I'm sure you've seen the film. And so at a young age, I think he was like, I don't know, maybe 9, 10, something like that, he became obsessed with the Titanic, and I think it's amazing because so many of us have gone through a Titanic phase. I went through a Titanic phase. I'm certain you have as well. I think a lot of us also went through an ancient Egypt phase as well. I think that's very common. And so in this book, he would read and see photos of the decadence and the opulence, and he would just pay lots of attention because it wasn't just the fact that it was luxury, it's the detail. Why? Like, why this crystal? Why this carpet? Like, just the story and all of it together, because it wasn't just the fact that it was fancy, it was all of it put together, the story behind it and the reason why. And so whenever he would go to his aunt's house, he would just read and reread that book over and over again. So I've never been to Durham, North Carolina, but I can't imagine it's a very large city, and I don't imagine it was a very large city in the 50s or the 60s. So one of his favorite places to go was the public library. And by the age of 12, he said that he had probably read every single magazine that the library had, because libraries have books, obviously, but they also have magazines. And this is where he discovered Vogue magazine. Like, he was always an avid reader, but when he discovered the glossy, glamorous, chic, and elegant Vogue magazine, that was like a light bulb, like a hallelujah moment for him. He like transported himself because he was a kid, you know, that imagination, just like leafing through those magazines. He would like transport himself into the dinners, the soirees, the evenings out, like whatever glamorous person, man or woman, was in the magazine, he would just like transport himself to their fancy affair. And he spent so much time at that library, and I honestly don't even know how many times he reread all those Vogue magazines. When he wasn't in school, like in the summer, for example, he would spend his afternoons at the library just, you know, reading Vogue magazine for free. Who wouldn't? And then he would walk home. There would be maybe some blackberry bushes around his home. And one thing that his family always had, like his grandmother, they always had delicious, like home-cooked Southern food. They didn't have a lot of like material possessions. She always worked. There was always enough. But one luxury that they always had was food. The food was always good, like fresh, home-cooked everything, like homemade biscuits, crispy bacon, every baked good pies, cakes, whatever, like everything was always homemade and so good. And so that was their luxury. Food was the thing that they would indulge in. Like any child growing up in the 60s, one thing that deeply impacted André in a positive, fabulous way was Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. Listen, when she and her husband, John F. Kennedy, was president, and when the inauguration happened, and when she did the White House tour showing off some of the remodeling and restoration, he was hooked. He was glued to the television. The way she spoke, the way she carried herself, the elegance, the way she was reserved, and you could see that she took a moment to think about what she was saying before saying it. Her reverence for history sparked a deep appreciation and love of antiques. It's a passion that he had later in life, antiquing and history, and Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy helped spur that. Her taste, her elegance, her chicness, hello, Jackie O. She is still a fashion icon to many people. Just the way that she carried herself and her style was like a huge imprint on him at a very, very young age, which I think probably happened to a lot of people around that time as well. Now, André never did things halfway. When he was into something, he was into something. And this was also the truth when he was a child. He basically did a deep dive into Jackie Kennedy with the resources that he did, because he would look through all the magazines that he had at the library, and he would see who is she sitting next to? Who is this socialite? What does this socialite do? What are their interests in? And he basically just like immersed himself into the world of Jackie Kennedy and everything that meant, like where she went to school, what did she study, what languages did she speak, what were her interests, who were her favorite designers, what did her perfume, like everything. He was obsessed, and I totally get that. I mean, I think we all do that still. Another person that deeply impacted him was Julia Child, the American chef and food instructor who helped bring French cuisine to America. She had her cooking show, and she also had a very deep reverence for French cuisine, French cooking, and she wanted to adapt it and make it accessible for Americans. And this helped spur his interest in France, in the French language, because most people who live in Durham, North Carolina, do not speak French that I'm aware of. But we will see later that André would go on to do many degrees in French studies. His interest and pursuit in the French language actually started when he went to high school. He attended Hillside High School, and he took 4 years of French studies. So French grammar, French literature, like French, that was basically his main interest in high school. He graduated high school in 1966, and then he went on to major in French studies at the North Carolina Central University. He excelled completely. He did very well for himself. He finished his Bachelor of Arts in French Literature in 1970, and then he received a full scholarship to Brown University. So Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. And he received his master's in French literature in 1972. And he also began pursuing his PhD, his doctorate, but he ended up dropping out and moving to New York. So not all bad. I believe he had already been accepted into his doctoral program, and he just decided to make some changes, which makes sense. He was very young, and so this was the time to make some moves. He was actually planning on becoming a French teacher because, I mean, that kind of seems like the natural progression. Like, what else am I going to do with a doctorate in French literature? Teach, I guess. He knew that he wanted to be out in the world. He knew he wanted to leave Durham, North Carolina, but where, to do what exactly, unsure. But he just knew that he was going to go on to bigger and better things. Now, when he was at Brown University, he made some connections, he made some friends. All the friends there were very wealthy and very rich. He was not, but he was able to get an unpaid internship at the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Arts in New York City. He had spent so much time reading and rereading Vogue magazine. He knew about the Met, he knew about the Costume Institute, and so this unpaid internship was just a great idea. And he ended up working directly for Diana Vreeland. Now, Diana Vreeland was a French-American fashion editor, columnist, former editor-in-chief of Vogue magazine, and part of the International Best Dressed List Hall of Famer. So quite a fabulous person. And if you're someone who has a deep reverence and passion and obsession for fashion and costume and art and literature, having a mentorship from her seems pretty priceless. Diana Vreeland was really the first person in the fashion world who saw how much potential André had, because he was so well educated. He was also just very well read. Like, he could talk to anyone about anything. That type of person who was just so well rounded, so well cultured and well read that he could speak to anyone about anything. He was just that intelligent. And so Diana knew that this kid was going very far. He was, I guess, in his mid-20s by this point, because he had just finished his master's. And he quickly became one of her favorite volunteers because, like I said, this was an unpaid internship. So it was more like a volunteer position. This was a sort of fashion finishing school for André because Diana had the same appreciation and reverence for culture, literature, fashion, style, elegance, luxury, all that. So they got along really well. And what's interesting is André was 6'6". Like, he was a giant of a man. He was so tall. And Diana was smaller, obviously. And he would just like follow her around, like just waiting on every word that she said, every instruction, just, you know, waiting as a sponge to just absorb as much information and knowledge as he could. And so it's just interesting to picture both of them, him just like towering over her and just like waiting on a bated breath to hear what she has to say next. As I keep saying, this was unpaid, and André was not rich. He had just finished grad school. People are not known to have money when they finish grad school, and so whatever money he had, by the time the internship was done, he was broke, flat broke. And this volunteer period ended around the holidays, just before Christmas. And Diana told him, listen, Christmas is coming, but stay in New York. In January, when we get back from the holidays, I'm going to make sure you get a job. I'm going to set something up for you. So do not go home to Durham, North Carolina, because if you go home, you're going to find a job teaching French somewhere and you're never going to come back. So stay put. And he was like, okay. At this point, he was sleeping on the floor of a friend's studio. He was broke, like I said. On Christmas Eve, he said that the only thing he had to eat that day is he found a can of like Hershey's chocolate syrup in the cupboard, and he ate that as a meal with a beautiful silver spoon, of course. You know, he still had taste. And Christmas Eve, his grandmother called him, because I imagine this may have been the first time that he spent Christmas Eve away from his family. And his grandmother was very supportive, but I think it was hard for her to understand why he wouldn't come home for Christmas Eve. And he kept trying to tell her, like, no, Miss Vreeland told me that I have to stay. She's going to find me a job. I have to stay. And his grandmother was very angry. Like, what are you doing? Like, it's Christmas Eve. You have to come home. Like, you have to come home. And he was like, no, I have to stay. She said she's going to find me a job. And his grandmother yelled out something to the extent of, I know you're sleeping with that white woman. Which is pretty funny because, André and Diana Vreeland did not have that type of relationship, first of all. And also, he was gay. But his grandmother did not, like, I don't know. I don't think she knew that he was gay. I don't think he ever came out to her. Maybe that wasn't even something that crossed her mind. But for her, the reason that he must be staying in New York over the holidays is because he's clearly hooking up with this white woman. Thought that was really funny. So when January began, Diana kept her promise. She sent letters to some of her friends, her nearest and dearest colleagues and friends. This included people like Andy Warhol, Carolina Herrera, Oscar de la Renta, Halston, you know, just the typical co-workers that she had, and some friends who might need an assistant or a receptionist or some sort of somebody to help them out, because André was known for being very helpful. She also made sure to invite André to all the right parties. So she invited him to some of Andy Warhol's parties where he got to make friends with Andy, and also Bianca Jagger, you know, just casually. Diana was his mentor, and they stayed friends for a very long time. Even when he no longer worked for her in any capacity, they remained the best of friends. And he ended up getting a job from Andy Warhol very shortly in January, like Diana had promised. And so he went to work at the Andy Warhol factory, and he started off as a receptionist. So he moved on up, he left his friend's floor, and he got himself a room at YMCA, and that's where he stayed for a little bit. And he started working for Andy Warhol, and he got to make lots of great connections here because, like I said, he was so well-mannered and well-spoken, and he could get along with anyone. So he really just needed the chance to meet some of these people in order, you know, he just needed someone to give him a break and to get the opportunity to prove how great he was. And so he did. And he became great friends with Bianca Jagger. and the two of them bonded over her friend, the shoe designer Manolo Blahnik. Andy Warhol had a magazine at the time called Interview, and this was the magazine that Andre worked for. And so Andre was a receptionist, but he also did interviews for Interview magazine because, like I said, he could talk to anyone about anything all the time. So he was a very good interviewer. He could put people at ease. He could relate to them. He could talk to them about things that were interesting to them and get really great interviews. His first interviews for the magazine were with the Christian Dior fashion house and also with Carolina Herrera. And a few years later, not that long actually, in 1975, this is another big break in Andre's career. He was tasked with interviewing German designer Karl Lagerfeld. At this point, he was working for Chloé, and he was in Paris. This is when Chloé launched their perfume. And so Andre was tasked in going to meet Mr. Karl Lagerfeld. The two got along very well, had a lot in common, because, as per usual, Andre had done his homework, and so he knew what he was talking about. He wasn't just saying, hey, how are you? How's the weather? You know, like he had something important to ask, and he would ask the designers and the people that he was meeting questions that they actually wanted to answer, not the same boring ones over and over again. Shortly after this, Andre left Interview magazine and moved on to Women's Wear Daily, which at the time was like the Bible of fashion. It was a very important publication. And he started off as fashion accessories director and would later go on to become its Paris bureau chief. In the first few weeks at Women's Wear Daily, he and Karl Lagerfeld, at this point they were friends, kept corresponding back and forth. Of course, they didn't have text message, so they were writing handwritten letters back and forth to each other, just talking about this and that. And one thing that really stood out to Andre about Karl is when they first met, like I said, Andre didn't have like the greatest wealth. He did not come from aristocracy. He was very working class. Karl gifted him clothing. He was like, they were doing the interview, and Karl said, come to the bedroom with me. And Andre was like, excuse me? And Karl's like, yeah, come into the bedroom. He was like, I don't know what's about to happen, but we're going to see. And Karl just opened up these giant trunks, these gorgeous luxury trunks. I think they were Goyard. And he started pulling out silks and shirts and clothing and all sorts of things, and just gave Andre like a giant armful like this of clothing, just like, here, take this, I think this will look good on you, I think you'll like this, take this. And Andre was like, okay, thank you for giving me beautiful like luxury pieces of clothing that would take me a long time to afford. I will take that, thanks. At Women's Wear Daily, Andre was only making about $75 a week, and so if he wanted to get himself a beautiful silk scarf or something luxury, it would take him a while to afford it. So he really appreciated this generosity, this kindness initially from Karl Lagerfeld. And one thing that's interesting about Andre is that he didn't leave Durham, North Carolina thinking, first I have to do this, then I move on to this, then I move on to this. He sort of just did what he did best and just excelled at it. Like, he was very hardworking, he was very diligent, he always did his homework, he was very well prepared, he knew what he was doing, and he just worked really hard. And with a bit of luck and just really great timing in the fashion world and fashion history, he was able to make really great connections. But they weren't just connections because they liked him, but it was also because he was so great at what he did that he was able to have this amazing career. But he didn't just like sit there in Durham like, haha, I know what I need to do. Like, it just worked out the way that it did. Eventually, Andre just stayed in Paris. How amazing is that? He was writing articles on new collections from Givenchy, Yves Saint Laurent, Karl Lagerfeld, Chloé, just literally living his best life in Paris. I mean, seriously, in your in your 20s in Paris working for fashion, who doesn't want to do that? And by this time, he had started to make a name for himself from the different companies that he'd worked for, like Interview and Diana Vreeland, Andy Warhol, Karl Lagerfeld. Like, he'd made a name for himself. However, regardless of how talented and hardworking and well-mannered and well-read and prepared he was, unfortunately, he did experience some racism at this moment in time. Even though André was very far from the Jim Crow segregated South that he grew up in, racism was still alive and well, and it still is to this day. So at the time, even though he was living his best life, doing the best work, doing great, there was some rivalry and animosity that was leveled towards him. And according to his own words, he was sort of naive. I think he thought that because he was so good at what he did, because he was so talented, that people would just respect him, you know? But I have a story here. Allegedly, there was a Yves Saint Laurent Rive Gauche publicist by the name of Clara Saint, who allegedly would play nice to André's face, but behind his back would refer to André as Queen Kong. Disgusting. I actually have a direct quote from him, from his book here. From his book. "I thought everyone liked me," I said. "I was young and naive. Here I was, running around Paris thinking I was successful, and the sophisticated, elegant people in the world of fashion were comparing me to an ape behind my back." He confided this to a few of his close friends, Karl Lagerfeld, Paloma Picasso, because even though he was well-educated and well-suited for the job and hardworking, there were some people who only saw him for his skin color and didn't care about him as a person. Another instance of racism from André's book. This is André Leon Talley, a memoir, The Chiffon Trenches, recommended. It's his own words here. And another instance that happened directly after this happened in the fall of 1979 with one of his bosses at Women's Wear Daily. The boss in question here, Michael Cody, made a trip from New York to Paris, and there was just like a big meeting, like a big corporate meeting for Women's Wear Daily. André was there. Lots of people were there from like different departments, etc. And in the middle of the meeting, Cody stood up and grandly announced, "André, there's rumors that you've been in and out of every designer's bed in Paris. This has got to end." I responded with stony silence, but in my head I thought, I must have been very busy because there are many designers in Paris. I have been in Karl Lagerfeld's bed, I have been in the beds of YSL, Claude Montana, Thierry Mugler, Kenzo, Yohei Yamamoto, Comme des Garçons, Sonia Ryko, all of these designers. I did sleep in Karl Lagerfeld's guest room sometimes, sure, but I was always alone in gilded splendor. I cannot imagine, like, the level of unprofessionalism, and that sounds like humiliating and degrading to have your boss scream out, "Hey, you're screwing half of Paris here, cut it out." There was literally absolutely no rumor. Like, this, it was completely unfounded. This guy just literally made it up and screamed it out in the middle. The meeting was huge. Tons of different departments. In an instant, all of his hard work, all of his credibility out the window. The accusation was stunning in its racism, and it had so many levels of hurt, insult, and pain. Michael Cody was a very important person and had always supported me. Now, here he was insinuating I was just a big black buck, sent to satisfy the sexual needs of designers, be they men or women. I had no talent, no point of view, or knowledge of fashion. And worst of all, he had made the accusation in front of the staff of Women's Wear Daily. All the men and women who he had worked hard for to earn their respect, gone like a flash. Seriously. So it was a pretty devastating moment in André's life. He spent 3 months staying in Karl Lagerfeld's guest room, just sort of coming to terms with what happened, because again, he had to like take the high road. He couldn't be the one to fly off the handle or like tell people off, because then he would look insane, you know? God. It's so unfair and so unjust. So after 3 months of sort of recuperating, he went back to New York. Karl paid for him. He gave him like a first class ticket to go home. And Diana Vreeland was there. Like, she knew him. She knew André. She knew these people were lying. They were jealous. They were racist. They were assholes. And so she reached out to him and helped him out. And this is when André's freelance career began. So he started working for French Vogue. He worked for the New York Times and even a few pieces of Interview magazine again, because he would be sent to interview people, to talk about different collections. And so this is where his freelance career started. Around this time, Eunice Johnson of Ebony magazine reached out to him. And this was the first time that André worked for a publication that his grandmother and his family knew and read. So he was very excited for that. And John H. Johnson, the husband of Eunice, they ran Ebony magazine, and they kept him on at Ebony for only 1 year because he proved to be too expensive for them. But after he left Ebony, he stayed friends with Eunice for a very long time. Now, in 1982, this is when Karl became the creative director of Chanel. We have a whole episode on that. You should definitely check it out. And for his debut collection, his debut launch, he had his good friend André flown first class back to Paris to interview him, to not review, but just to write up about this collection here. Now, let's move on to Vogue magazine, of course. So André actually interviewed for them twice. You know, if at first you don't succeed, you have to try again. He succeeded in 1983 at getting the position there. He interviewed, I think, in 80 or 81 and didn't get hired, but that's okay. But they kept him not in rotation, but they kept him in mind. And then there was an interview that he had done with Karl Lagerfeld that was very, not off the cuff, but it was very different than a lot of the formal, stuffy, boring interviews where they were just talking about things other than, so which fabrics did you use and what was your inspiration? Like just different interesting things to talk about. And this impressed people at Vogue magazine, so they called him back in 1983. Even though he had suffered setbacks, his capabilities, his perseverance is really what helped him out, because he had made impressions on very important people. And even the people who were racist shitbags clearly were intimidated by him. Like, they were not scared of him, but they were worried about his talent and how great he was. And I think that's why those people were so terrible, because they were concerned about their jobs and didn't want him to get any better. In my opinion, don't come for me. And when he got the job at Vogue, he was brought on as a fashion news editor. And when he had gone in to do like the official signing of paperwork or whatever, as he was leaving the Vogue office, he walked by the office of the new editor-in-chief, Anna Wintour. And they saw each other, just like polite smile, like hello. Mm-hmm. And he left the office and he got on the subway, and his apartment was only like 2 metro stops away, so very short. By the time he got to his apartment, there was a handwritten note from Anna Wintour congratulating him on getting the position and welcoming him to Vogue. I took the subway to my Union Square apartment, a mere 2 stops away from Vogue's office. A messenger envelope was waiting for me beneath my door, inside a beautiful handwritten note. Welcome to Vogue. I look forward to working with you, Anna Wintour. That was fast, I thought, but it also sent a clear message. I had an ally at Vogue magazine, a formidable one. That's amazing. He started from 83 to 87. That was his beginning at Vogue as fashion news director, and then later as American Vogue's first African-American male creative director. He held this position from 1988 to 1995. When he got his position at Vogue, this is when, I think André has always, or did always, advocate for diversity within the fashion world, because in many ways he was the first of many. He was the first of many in many different settings. Was it, regardless if it was boardroom meetings or front row of fashion shows, he often stood out because he was 6'6", but also he was Black. There were not many African American or Black people sitting front row at Parisian haute couture fashion shows. There were not, simply put. He was the first in many situations, and he knew what that was like. He knew how uncomfortable that was. He knew how targeted he could be. He knew how vulnerable he could be. So when he got more power, as he got more power, he started advocating more and more for diversity, for inclusion, for helping people out, because he knew how hard it was for him, and he didn't want other people to have to go through what he did. Regardless of if it was designers, photographers, editors, journalists, whatever, in the fashion sphere, in front of the camera, behind the camera, and in every aspect. He always advocated for more diversity, more people of color, more African Americans, because he knew what it was like. He didn't want other people to have to go through what he did, and he wanted it to make it easier for other people. You know, he didn't, whenever there would be like the first African American to have this title in the fashion world, he was happy for it. He was happy for them, but also he would say, why did it take so long for this to happen? Like, this should not be a wow moment. Like, we should have this be part of like regular life. When he would go to big boardroom meetings, he was often the only Black person in the room, and he knew what it was like to advocate for yourself in a space that was not safe. It's hard to advocate for yourself when you do not see yourself represented across the board. And so he worked at making the American dream accessible to other people, because he wasn't the type of person who thought, well, it was hard for me, so it should be hard for you. He's like, no, it was hard for me, so let me make it easier for you, which is great. This is how people should be. Like, if something is difficult for you, why not make it easier for the next person coming up? He became a role model and a mentor for so many people in the fashion world. He advocated for designers, for models, for photographers, everything across the board. He helped out so many different people and encouraged them and mentored them and gave them a safe space and just encouraged them. And that's part of the legacy that he left behind, and that's part of the reason why he's so iconic and larger than life and so well loved by so many people, because he wasn't the type of person to just gatekeep and keep everything hidden. He's like, no, let me help you out, let me make things easier for you. In 2008, Beyonce was the cover of the September issue, which is the largest and most important issue of Vogue magazine, and it was the first time they had an African American photographer doing the shoot, Tyler Mitchell. André said, this is great, like, I'm happy to see this, but again, it shouldn't take this long to have an African American photographer in the US do a cover for the September issue. So, and André stated publicly that having an ally like Anna Wintour helped him out tremendously, because she backed him up. She had his back. She wasn't like those people in France and Paris when he went there early in his career who were saying racist things behind his back and in front of his face in giant boardroom meetings. She had his back. She knew what he was capable of. Of course, he had flaws like everyone else, but she knew he was talented and she wasn't going to put up with that. And I think having this backing from Anna made it so people couldn't come for him for stupid reasons anymore. Anna and André did have an on-again, off-again friendship. They had two falling outs, like two pretty big ones, but they did reconcile shortly before his passing. And one of the really iconic things that André did was in 1996, he did an editorial for Vanity Fair where he cast Naomi Campbell, the great Naomi Campbell, as Scarlett O'Hara, and they decided to redo Gone with the Wind, but reversing the races and having Naomi Campbell in like the full Southern belle, Southern flair. It was a very beautiful spread. And under André's mentorship and help, Naomi Campbell became the first Black woman to be the cover for the September issue of Vogue magazine. Like I said, this is the largest and most important issue of Vogue magazine. I mean, being on Vogue magazine is really important, but the September issue is like the highest you could ever go. So making sure that Naomi got that spot was very crucial and very important for people to see themselves represented in their skin, in their hair, and seeing themselves on the September issue of Vogue magazine. Also, André helped influence Michelle Obama's fashion because he introduced her to Taiwanese Canadian designer Jason Wu. Now, if you're not familiar, Jason Wu has basically dressed Michelle Obama in all of her iconic looks. And so if it wasn't for André, Michelle and Jason would not have met. In 1995, André moved to Paris and he served as contributing director for W magazine. In 1998, he returned to Vogue as editor at large and he held the position until 2013. He published 3 memoirs, one called Alt, André Leon Talley, and then Alt 365, and then this one here, The Chiffon Trenches. I've only read The Chiffon Trenches. It's great. It's a wonderful book. It does feel a little bit like a fashion education because there is so much name dropping, not only in fashion regarding designers, but photographers, painters, artists of all generations, plays, operas, music. Like, this man was so well educated that he expected you to keep up with him. So I recommend reading it. It's very good. It's very fun. It's a great book, but just maybe have Google open on the side to Google, who is this person? Who is this? Also, André was a guest judge on America's Next Top Model. Remember America's Next Top Model? I do. He was on there from 2010 to 2011. He was on the guest panel, or like he was a judge on the panel of judges for a year. I think it was 2 seasons of the show. And then he also worked, he served as international editor of Numero Russia. Numero is a fashion magazine, but he resigned after 12 issues due to LGBTQ laws in Russia. André was also the subject of a documentary, which I highly recommend you watch. It's called The Gospel According to André. You can find it online. Watch it. It's so good. I mean, The Gospel According to André will have a lot of the information that I shared today, but if you enjoyed today's episode, you would enjoy the documentary. It's great. Again, it gives you this like opulent, rich fashion, art, history lesson and education, which I really appreciate. And I think if you're here, you might appreciate as well. What I got from the documentary is that André was such an unpretentious person. Even though he was very well educated, he spoke multiple languages, he loved French literature, he could also gossip about Wendy Williams. He just seemed really down to earth. Like, he was just so knowledgeable about so many things that he could literally speak to anyone about any subject, because he just was this like had this immeasurable wealth in his brain. And he did go on the Wendy Williams show as well, which I love. I used to watch that show all the time, not so much anymore. And Wendy Williams asked him point blank about his sexuality. Of course she did, it's Wendy Williams. And he answered, "I'm not heterosexual. I'm saying I'm fluid in my sexuality, darling." I can't quite do his accent, but yeah, so there we go. André still remained a practicing Christian. He attended the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, and it was still a part of his life, his maybe not everyday life, but the church, the Black Southern Church, played such an important part of his life, and it seemed to have a positive impact on his life. Like I said, Anna and André had a couple falling outs, or fallings out, not sure. I think it's falling outs. The first one was in 1995 and lasted until 2018. Apparently it was over creative differences, and then the two fell out again when Anna took away his spot at the Met Gala red carpet. I would also be pissed off if I had a spot on the Met Gala red carpet and Anna took it away. I would be pissed too. But apparently they reconciled shortly afterwards. Unfortunately, in January of this year, 2022, André suffered a heart attack and passed away due to the complications of the heart attack and also COVID-19. He was only 73, which I think is young. I think anything under 80 is young. He did live a very rich life, very happy life, a very well-rounded life. He did a lot in his 73 years, but I just think he was such a magnanimous person, such a unique person that, you know, the combination of Southern charm, Southern manners, the French literature, the fashion, like all of it combined was so unique and so André. And it's a shame. I think we will definitely not see anyone similar to him for a very long time, similar to Karl Lagerfeld. Those two were very unique in their own way, and I don't think we're going to see anyone close to them in a very long time. So that is the life of André Leon Talley. I tried to give you guys as much information as possible, but honestly, I could have sat here for 5 hours and given you guys much more information, so I decided to just whittle it down a bit. I recommend reading his books. The documentary is excellent as well. So yeah, this is the life, the legacy, the importance of André Leon Talley. Make sure to leave a comment down below, leave a like anytime you engage with my channel. It always encourages me and my channel and my videos to grow. So leave a like, leave a comment, let me know what you think. Some of you are older than me, so you may remember André Leon Talley differently than I do. You may have different experiences and remember him differently, so feel free to leave them down below. Some of you always apologize for leaving really long novels. I love them. I love the novels. Leave a novel. I love it. And remember, there's a new episode the first Friday of every month. So that is it for today. Thank you all so much for stopping by. Hope you have a beautiful day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.